So that piece of paper should be coming around that has the sign in. So if you don't get it now, just make sure you get it before you leave. Let me load up the test just to kind of give myself a mental framework to go through this. As I'm loading this up now, on the test, or for the test I should say, again there's 70 questions, multiple choice. Those questions are taken from the test bank, the big one that comes with the online, like the website that you log in to. But I get extra features that you don't, so there's a variety of different versions of the questions. That's questions, about 70 questions again. I'm shooting for about 5 per chapter. There might be one chapter that has 4, and there might be one that has 6, but it's going to be about 70 questions, okay? Then the next 70 roughly questions, it's recording, you're good, right?
Yeah, you betcha.
Okay, good. The next 70 questions are going to be matching in groups of 10. Matching in groups of 10 mostly, and then there's going to be a section that is identification, where it's parts of the brain, you have to identify the parts of the brain, okay? No essay, that was one question I got a lot, no essay, short essay, nothing, it's all going to be done on the clicker. There won't be any questions that are very specific to the TED Talk videos. So for example, one of them we watched, the lady, Ellen Sachs, she said a view inside mental illness. She talked about schizophrenia, so there might be some general questions about schizophrenia on the text, or on the test, but you would be able to answer those just by studying the notes in the book, right? Okay? So you wouldn't have to remember something specific from her video only, all right? Anybody else didn't get the sign-in sheet? If you missed it, you can sign in right there. The internet's still being messed up, isn't it? Has that been all day?
Yeah.
That's wonderful, because I have like the...
Oh, you have the plans, huh? You poor guy.
But I can just talk, I mean, that's fine. I can just look off of the little notes that I had on my phone.
I walked into the,
You throw it away.
I walked into your classroom right away. Turns out that's world history right now.
Yep,
That was a little embarrassing, not gonna lie.
that's why we're here.
2-minute intermission.
Yeah. Yeah, get it to me this weekend, that's fine.
Ricky.
Are you going to the review session or not? Okay, all right, see you later, that's fine. Yep. Okay,
Hi,
hey,
Ricky.
so
Right now.
the test I'm building on the website and the internet's down, right? So what I'm going to try to get on my phone at the same time. No, we're still doing a final, okay? But
Crap.
yeah. I'll just use, like in class, we were writing stuff on the board, and then I did that in every class and kind of talked to some people a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of use that as a guide to discuss things. So in order, chapter 1. 2 main things that you need to know for chapter 1 in general. The 8 theories and applying them, and general stuff about research methods. So 8 theories, briefly. Let's do it like one at a time. So just start over here. Kelly, you want to give us one, and then we'll just keep going. Biological. Humanistic. Cognitive. Evolutionary. Psychodynamic.
What is
Biopsychosocial. Behavioral. And I think we got one more, right?
Sociocultural.
Okay, so those 8 theories that we did on the table, if you saved that table for your assignment, you could study that, that would be helpful. So know what's the main idea for each of those, who's the main person that developed it, what are the core assumptions that they have about human behavior and all that. That in general is the most important thing I would say, because a lot of the chapters are basically applying those theories. Take personality, for example. Behaviorists believe that personality is a set of learned patterns of behavior, right? Therapy. Psychodynamic therapists believe in free association, for example, so they want to get at what's going on in the unconscious. So if you know those 8 things and you can apply those across the board, that'll be very helpful. So knowing the 8 things and then applying them, who is the main person for each one, what are the core assumptions, that's the bulk of stuff for chapter 1. The other part is on research methods. So you have things like experimental group, control group, independent variable, dependent variable, validity and reliability, etc. So I decide I want to see who does well on tests based on something, and I decide to give one class gum before a test and another class doesn't get gum, or one class gets gum that has caffeine in it, another class gets regular gum. Let's take the gum with caffeine and the regular gum, right? In that instance, what's the independent variable?
What is that on the test?
The independent variable,
What you're measuring.
what you change, type of gum. Yep, what you have control of is the independent variable. What's the dependent variable?
The reaction to the gum.
What you're measuring, how well people do on the test in this instance, okay? So you have the experimental group and the control group. The control group is the group that gets the regular gum. In this instance, the experimental group would be the gum with the caffeine, right? So let's say I do that test and over again I get the same results. What is that? Reliability. What if I'm measuring what I really claim to measure? What's that called? Validity. So you could have a study that's both valid and reliable. You could have one that's valid but not reliable. You could have one that's reliable but not valid. Okay? So be able to identify some basics with research methodology. Next. Yeah, the computer's just not going to work. That's fine. Chapter 2, biology. So do you remember the breakdown of different divisions in the nervous system? So I don't know if I'm lined up in the camera, O'Connell, or not.
Oh, you're perfect.
So you remember the divisions of the nervous system? So we talked about autonomic, okay, sympathetic, parasympathetic, all that stuff. Okay, so for example, you have somatic, autonomic. You could divide them into different branches.
You need a new marker.
Yeah, I know. But that thing would help you. So autonomic is automatic, somatic is voluntary. Sympathetic would be, in general, things that speed up, that controls that fight or flight response. Parasympathetic generally slows systems down. There's a few exceptions. Digestion is one, because it's like fight or flight. You gotta survive. You don't need to digest food at that time, right? So not the body, the nervous system is gonna slow down digestion to divert resources to other things, okay? So be aware of some of those things that would help you. Cells, basic terms like neuron, axon, dendrite. For the identification portion of the test, there'll be a picture of a neuron. You have to identify the parts, right? But there'll also be questions where it will say something like, when you get smarter, you grow more of these. And the answer would be?
Dendrite.
Dendrites, right? There'd be a question like, potentially, I mean, I'm still finishing, so I don't know for sure, but there potentially could be a question that's like, what's the gap between neurons called? Synapse, yep. So there'll be questions like that. Then there's also the part where you have to identify. So in the biological section, there's some on nature, nurture. That's in development also. But then there's also like, this part of the brain does this. These are the chemicals that send messages across synapses, right? So factual questions like that. And there's also a bunch that have to do with identification in that section as well. So I'm planning on going super fast through everything and then at the end asking questions, okay? So I'm just giving you kind of it in a nutshell right now. Chapter 3 is on sensation and perception. So if you think of what we did in class, what your assignments were, little activities that would be helpful. What was the activity we did with sensation and perception?
Absolute threshold difference.
Yeah, you're explaining the terms, just
Oh.
what was the activity we did?
Music.
Music,
Try to taste the difference.
taste the difference of the water, salt and sugar,
The
weights,
Can we do
okay?
the cinnamon one?
The colored pencil thing, okay? So when did you first see it? What color was it? So with the colored pencil thing, that was testing peripheral vision and how different parts of your eye view things differently because of the focusing of sensory cells in the back of the eye. What were those two types of cells called? Rods and cones. Which one sees color? Cones. Okay. So there'll be things like that. There'll also be things like absolute threshold where you get a scenario and you have to identify what is Christian sensing, or why is he sensing this change in volume. If it's a change in volume, if he can hear it, and it's a change in volume, taste, whatever else, what's that called? The ability to detect the difference. You already know it's salty, but now you can tell it's more salty.
Absolute threshold.
No, it's
Difference, threshold, or just noticeable difference. The point at which you first can tell that there's salt in the water or in the steak or whatever else is absolute threshold. So the terminology is the same, doesn't matter for sight, sound, taste, whatever, okay? So that's sensation, that's the focus of sensation. Perception has to do with, again, how we make sense of the information we get. So you'd have to know the difference between sensation and perception, obviously. But perception is focused on, again, how we make sense of the information we get. So as it relates to perception, you'll talk about things like figure ground perception. You remember the vases faces kind of illusion that we looked at? Where it's white and black, and if you see the white, then you see the vases, I think. If you see the black, you see the faces. So be aware of some of those. The Necker cube, how you're looking at a cube and sometimes it looks like this part is in the front and then your perception changes and it's like different, right? You're sensing the same thing, but how your brain makes sense out of it is different. So there's some different cues for perception, like monocular and binocular depth cues. You might have some questions about that, discussion on there. Figure ground perception I talked about. Linear perspective, how you're looking at a road and over time what happens to the road? What does it look like? Yeah, it looks like it comes together at a single point in the distance. In reality it doesn't come together, but that's how you perceive it, okay? So there'll be some application questions about that. So previous learning obviously influences perception. You take somebody that has no exposures, they've never seen a cube in their entire life for some reason, I don't know why, but whatever, and they look at that cube, the Necker cube illusion, they're going to interpret it different than somebody that sees cubes all the time. So, the Mueller-Lyer illusion was an example of that, where you have people in a room and the room is all weird, the lines are all different, you can't tell the difference between them, right? If you have people that haven't really been around buildings, they interpret that differently, okay? So that's chapter 3 in a nutshell, sensation and perception. Chapter 4 is focused on consciousness. So consciousness is the state of awareness and self that we all have. We understand consciousness largely by looking at what it is not, by studying differences in consciousness. Those are called altered states of consciousness. So in the text, what were like 3 of the main ways that we analyzed altered states of consciousness? Or I should say, what are 3 of the main examples we looked at?
Hypnosis.
Hypnosis was one.
Drugs.
Drugs and sleep.
Sleep, yeah.
Okay, so let's start with sleep. Depending on the theorist that you're looking at, some theorists go there's 4 stages of sleep and then there's the last stage. Some do there's 3 in the last stage. So if you see the theorist that says 4, they usually say stage 1, stage 2, and then all the way through 4, and then they go REM. The other one says N1, N2, N3, basically stands for not REM sleep, and then REM, right? So the tendency is, as you're progressing through the stages, your brain waves level off, your brain activity goes down until you're in the deepest stage. What's the deepest stage of sleep?
N3.
N3. But then when you hit REM, then your brain gets more active, right? What occurs mostly in REM? Dreaming. Dreaming. Nightmares also, yep. So night terrors would be in N3. What's the difference between nightmares and night terrors?
You don't remember night terrors?
Don't remember night terrors, do remember nightmares, also the stage they take place in. So drugs, there's a table in the book that relates to classes of drugs, and it kind of tells you what they do. If you study that table, that would be helpful. So hallucinogens institute hallucinations, right? Opiates mess with pain, tolerance, all that stuff. Cannabinoids, depressants, stimulants, like be able to identify some of those general differences for there. Also, like how do drugs function? What do drugs do when they affect us?
They alter our consciousness.
How? Like on a biological, like microscopic level, what do they do?
Release dopamine.
More general. They don't necessarily release dopamine.
As a chemical releases?
Yeah, so drugs basically mess with neurotransmitters. So they get in there and then they end up in those slots that like receive it, the receptors. Remember the graphic that we saw? There's like a little spot in the synapse where it's basically designed to take those neurotransmitters. Drugs get in there, the body interprets them as a neurotransmitter. So one of the problems with drugs is they mess up the body's ability to do that normally. So later, you can damage the bodies so much that it's not gonna function normally. So you'll be aware of some of that. And then we talked a little bit about hypnosis and some of the theories behind that, the ways some people think that you're basically splitting somebody's consciousness. Some people think that they're role playing, like when they're being hypnotized, they're not really in an altered state of consciousness per se. They're just following what the person says they should. Okay, chapter 5 is all about learning. There is 3 main ideas that were discussed in chapter 5. With learning, one would be classical conditioning, one would be operant conditioning, and one would be social learning. So let's break down classical conditioning a little bit. Some of the terminologies you need to know for classical conditioning would be unconditioned, conditioned, stimulus, unconditioned and conditioned response, and then neutral stimulus. So let's use an example of a taste aversion. Remember we had our discussion on a taste aversion? Who had a taste aversion that you'd be willing to share again? Like a food that you liked, but then you ate it when you were sick and now you can't stand it. Somebody in here has to have a taste aversion.
Fish.
Fish? Okay. So normally, you cook fish normal, you do it all correctly, you eat the fish, it's fine, you get the flu, now you can't stand the taste of tilapia or any fish at all or whatever, okay? So, in that example, what would the unconditioned response be?
Throwing up.
Yeah, feeling sick, throwing up. What's the conditioned response?
Not liking fish. Not eating.
Feeling nausea.
Throwing up also. In classical conditioning, the unconditioned response and conditioned response are the same behavior. So to use Pavlov's dog's example, what was the behavior?
Slobbering.
Salivated, right? In Pavlov's example, they salivated to the bell after conditioning, but before they salivated in the presence of food. They would salivate in the presence of food also after conditioning. So back to your example with fish, okay, what's the unconditioned stimulus?
Eating fish.
Fish.
Bro.
That's the conditioned stimulus. Normally you eat fish, you don't get sick, right? Assuming it's cooked correctly and everything. Okay?
Having
Because
the
you
flu?
learned to not like the fish because you were sick when you ate it. What's the unconditioned stimulus? The flu, whatever it was that made you sick in the first place, okay? So the unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that does not have to be learned. The dogs, they're presented with the food. They didn't have to learn to salivate, it was just natural, right? Okay, so unconditioned stimulus stays the same. After conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus still works. So the way you determine whether it's in response, or whether you determine if it's the unconditioned response or conditioned response is what causes it. Go ahead, Daniel.
So then would the neutral stimulus be the fish?
Yes.
Yes.
Before conditioning, the neutral stimulus would be the fish.
Okay.
In the case of Pavlov's example, what's the neutral stimulus?
The bell.
The bell. So after conditioning, the neutral stimulus becomes what?
The conditioned stimulus.
Conditioned stimulus. So that there's like 5 questions about that scenario. It's not going to be fish or the bell necessarily, but there'll be about 5 questions about classical conditioning. Okay. Pavlov was the guy that discovered that. John Watson also refined it with little Albert and rats and fuzzy animals and banging pots together, right? So what's the other type of conditioning called? Operant conditioning. Who's the main guy? B.F. Skinner's the main guy with that. So Skinner, Pavlov, and Watson are 3 of the main behaviorists. So in operant conditioning, what are the terms that you use?
Reinforcement.
Reinforcement, punishment, and
Positive, negative.
positive and negative, okay? So if I add something to you, adding is what?
Positive.
Positive. Take something away,
Negative.
negative. If I do something, somebody else does something to you, whatever, it makes it less likely that you're going to engage in a behavior.
Punishment.
Punishment, more likely, reinforcement. So be able to combine those and figure out a scenario. So I'm upset at somebody in class, whoever it is, dog is in the back, not really paying attention. I pick up something and throw it at her, hit her in the head, right? And then because of that, she's afraid, she's more likely to pay attention in the future now, okay? She'd be less likely to not pay attention, right? So I've added something to her, positive. She's gonna be less likely to be distracted, do whatever else. Punishment, right? Okay? What if Janaea, I tell her, I'm like, hey, show up instead of 30 seconds before class starts, show up a little bit earlier, and I'll let you skip 5 sections on the final. What would that be? I'm not really telling you this. It's not positive
No,
reinforcement.
negative reinforcement.
Negative reinforcement because
You're taking away questions.
took away questions. Okay, so the scenarios I give you aren't gonna be that exactly, but be able to identify those scenarios, okay? The last type of learning for chapter 5 would be social learning. Albert Bandura was the big guy with that. Remember, he had the Bobo doll. So what went down with the Bobo doll?
Kids were more likely to display violence if they saw someone beating up the Bobo doll.
Yep, so what's that process where you see a behavior and you copy it? Modeling, yep, so modeling. Yep, so you're copying the behavior, you're modeling. The person that's doing it is modeling the behavior, okay? So, again, social learning plays a role as well. Schedules of reinforcement is another important thing for this. So that's like, remember we talked about fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable interval. Which one's the most powerful? Which one works the best to develop a conditioned response?
Fixed interval?
Interval's time-based, ratio is number of occurrences. Fixed is consistent, variable is variable. Which one works the best? Variable, ratio. Gambling, video games operate on that process. Two very addictive things, right? You're gambling, you're like, maybe next time I'll win. Maybe next time I'll win. Hit me, maybe next time I'll win. You're playing blackjack, right? Hit me, maybe next time I'll win. Might be 5 times, it might be 10 times, it might be 2 times, you don't know. Because if you knew that it was every 3 times you were doing something, you would be like, oh, after the 3rd time, 1, 2, 3, I won, then you'd quit, you wouldn't want to do it for a while again, right? But it's that unknownness that makes it so addicting, that makes it work so well, okay? All right, so that's chapter 5 in a nutshell. Chapter 6 has to do with memory. 2 main things there. Processes of memory and types of memory. Okay, processes of memory. ESR, what are they?
Encoding.
Encoding. So you get the memory in, then that's encoding, right?
Yep.
It's sitting there. So I'm not accessing the memory. Randomly, I'm like, oh, I think of my best friend in high school, Aaron. Boom. Okay, it's sitting there. I'm not accessing it. I don't know why I thought of that example, but I haven't literally thought about my best friend from high school maybe in a couple days. I don't know. Okay, so but it's there. Like if I didn't consciously think of him for like the next 5 weeks, somebody asked me who was your best friend in high school, I'd pull it out, right? So it's storage. It's just sitting there. But when I pull it out, it's called
Retrieval.
retrieval. So know those things that help those things to work, like retrieval cues. The difference between recognition and recall, things that help in memory processes, so mnemonic devices, it's escaping me now, I need some of these, right? I need some retrieval cues. The primacy and recency effect, so first thing on the list, last thing on the list, all that stuff, okay? So encoding, storage, retrieval. Then you have 3 types of memory. What are these?
Sensory,
Sensory,
short-term, long-term.
short-term, and long-term. So be able to break those down also. You break down long-term, you have procedural memory, and then you have declarative memory. You can break those memories down into other types too as well. Okay? So conceptually, that's the main idea that you have to know for chapter 8. Types of memory and processes of memory. Also, there'll be some questions about just the basic functioning of memory. For example, what systems are involved. So, you remember we watched the video on Clive Waring, the guy who can play the piano really well. He had some type of infection that caused swelling in his brain, and his damage was very selective to a certain part. What part was damaged in him, do you remember? Hippocampus, yep. So what system is really messed up for him?
Memory.
Which memory system?
Storage.
well, which process of memory, I should say, is most messed up?
Encoding.
Encoding, exactly. He can remember stuff from before just fine. He can't form any new memories. So he has problems transferring stuff from short-term to long-term. So there's a few questions about scenarios like that. Okay, chapter 7 is on cognition. Cognition, if you hear the term cognition, what is that? That's thinking, yep. It's specifically mental processes. So, and not just like memory, it's thinking. So, metacognition, for example, is where you think about thinking. There's different types of thinking we engage in. So metacognition is where you're stopping to analyze your thinking processes. Problem solving is discussed in this chapter also. So if you have a rule of thumb strategy for solving something, what is that called? Heuristics. And she's like, oh.
I don't know why that word came.
Yeah. What is it called if it's a step-by-step, like do this, do this, do this, do this? Algorithms. Yep. So problem-solving strategies are discussed a little bit in there. In addition, you have like units of thought. Language is discussed in cognition a little bit, because when we think in a combination of images. Those are called mental images, right? And then we also think in words. So, yeah, so I tell you, think about what you're doing later. You think about, like, maybe you see an image of your house or your car or whatever, but it's also like there's a narrator going on in your head, right? So in languages, what's the most basic unit of sound called?
No, phonics.
No, you're close. Phone something.
Photographic.
Phonemes. Phonemes. Yeah. What's the most basic unit of meaning called? Morpheme. Phoneme, sound, morpheme, meaning. So in the word keys, right? The letter S is both a phoneme and a morpheme, right? It's a sound, there's one sound there. But by adding the S, I'm also changing the meaning to make it plural. Okay? So language is in there also, and some things with language, like the linguistic relativity hypothesis or the Saber-Whorf hypothesis, other things. Intelligence is discussed a little bit also in cognition. So things like measuring intelligence, so IQ tests, how IQ tests are a measure of mental age, right? Theories of intelligence, like Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence. You have the G and S factors, general intelligence versus specific intelligence. That's in the section on cognition also. Okay, chapter 8 in a nutshell is on development across the lifespan. I think the computer's working now. Wow. I shouldn't say anything, I'll curse it. Okay, development. So, nature versus nurture debate is in there. There's maybe a couple questions about like development, maybe one or two about biological development in the womb or like with babies, right? Infantile amnesia, fetal, germinal, embryo stage, all that stuff. One or two questions about that. Most of the questions on the test that relate to development have to do with the theories though. So the theories of how people develop. So some of the big names to remember and focus on here would be Piaget, Kohlberg, Erikson. I'm not going to be specific about the Freudian approach and that you have to remember the stages. So remember, Freud had the 5 stages. I have a heuristic to remember that personally. It's OAPLG. So oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stage. Right? You don't have to memorize those in order, but know that fixation's a concept. Know that Freud had a theory, right, etc. Piaget's theory is very important. Piaget's theory, 4 stages, right? Yep. What's the first stage?
Sensory motor.
Sensory motor.
Sensory motor. Second stage?
Pre-operational.
Pre-operational. Third stage? Concrete operational. Fourth stage?
Formal operational.
Formal operational. So, identify the stages in order, know what goes on in each stage. Kohlberg's theory was focused on what? Moral reasoning. Yeah. Pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional. Erikson's theory was psychosocial development. So it's about how in different ages you have a key struggle you have to overcome. So your struggle, stage 5 in adolescence, is identity versus role confusion. Like, what is your identity? What am I going to do with my life, basically? You didn't think that everybody necessarily struggled with that, but most people in that stage do. And then, so you don't have to like list those in order, but you should know the general concept about what goes on in the stages. So it's a struggle. And then also the general concept that if you don't fulfill those problems earlier, you're gonna have problems later, right? Okay, so different nature versus nurture, heritability, genetics, and the different stages. Okay, chapter 9, motivation and emotion. As it relates to motivation, big concepts there would be intrinsic, extrinsic, incentives, needs versus drives, and so on. Okay. Oh shoot, sorry.
What song was it? Let it go.
Look at my son here, he's just in a trance. Oh,
Should I zoom in?
wait, I don't think I see you.
We're coming. We're
Oh,
coming.
you're coming? Random.
Just a quick intermission.
Okay, he's in a trance. They're not play too much or they'll flag it as like. So you know in that song, you know in the song, towards the end, she does it a couple times, and the last time, she goes, "Let the storm rage on," but it's like really high.
Yeah.
We have a doll that you push a button and it sings that, and my son tries to sing, he's like, every time the doll gets to that part, he goes, oh great, it's pretty funny. Okay, sorry, I hit the wrong button and I got sidetracked. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 was on what again?
Motivation.
Motivation and emotion, thank you. So, needs, drives, incentives, extrinsic, intrinsic, some of the theories behind motivation, like drive reduction theory, how different things motivate different people differently, right? So if I was like, hey, I'll give you a dilly bar if you sprint down to the end of that. Literally you have to run as fast as you can, touch that wall, run as fast as you can back. That's it. Who would do that for a dilly bar?
Two.
But you literally had to run absolutely as hard as you could. Okay? So what if it was like from here to the office and back? You had to sprint as hard as you could.
Oh gosh.
Okay? So hands go down, right? So people are weighing it up. What if it was $1,000? Dead sprint as hard as you could to the office and back. I think everybody in here would do it, right? Okay, so, but again, different people interpret those things differently. As it relates to emotion now, what brain systems are involved in emotion? I'm not going to be very specific, like what does the Schachter-Singer theory say about emotion, but there are some kind of application questions that if you knew those things, they would help you to answer a little bit more completely. So for example, facial feedback hypothesis, you feel the muscles in your face, and then that's what you interpret as the emotion, right? So I'm not going to like have a section where you have to match those theories together, but knowing that concept would help you to understand some stuff. Okay? All right, chapter 10. Chapter 10 is on stress. So terminologies, distress, eustress, theories about how people handle stress, different ideas related to that. So for example, in general, is it better to have no stress at all? Absolutely none.
No.
No, because
I mean, you have no reactions. You stress.
it relates to the previous chapter. You're not going to be motivated to do a lot of things. So if you like won the your parents won the lottery, and then they're like, we'll take care of whatever you need for the rest of your life. That's going to lead to a lot of people like living in the basement and getting up at 11 and playing video games way too much and all that. Is it working? Still good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Had to reset.
All right, good. So, a moderate, but you don't want to have too much stress, right? You have too much, you're going to get burned out, you'll have problems. So, another thing you should be aware of is the general adaptation syndrome. So, remember that kind of bell curve, gravel looking thing?
Yeah.
So what's the first thing in that three-stage model of how people respond to stress?
Stress,
Alarm.
Alarm,
alarm,
resistance, exhaustion. Exactly. So another thing as it relates to stress would be primary, it's escaping me now. Primary and secondary, it's not evaluation, but it's,
Response.
no, it's
Appraisal.
appraisal, thank you, yep. Yep, so primary appraisal is, does this, like, is this a threat to me? What does secondary appraisal tell us?
What are you gonna do? What
Are you gonna deal with it? Yeah, exactly, okay? So also with stress, yeah, like I said, physiological effects, distress, eustress, all that stuff. Oh, okay, social psych. Social psych is focused on the socio-cultural approach, obviously, it's how groups and culture influence people. In social psych, we're a little bit more concerned about a smaller study than society as a whole, but that does play a role. So those are things like in-group, out-group, status, role, bystander effect, some of the major experiments that were done related to that. So if we talk about probably the three most famous experiments in social psychology, we talked about all three. Stanford and prison experiment, Phil Zimbardo was one. That's all about roles and how the roles that people have would affect their behavior. There is the shock study. Who did that study?
Milgram.
Stanley Milgram. What's that all about?
Obedience.
Authority.
Yeah, obedience to authority, exactly. And then the other one that had to do with the line lengths, what was that?
Oh, with the Confederates and the.
Yeah. Solomon Ash's line study. So that's where they had the three lines, you remember? And they said which line matches this other line, and they wanted to see, like, if Malia was the person that we were experimenting on, everybody else is in on it, and everybody says, well, it's line one that matches, and clearly it's not line one. What's Malia gonna do? So in that instance, a lot of people would agree with everybody else because they didn't wanna rock the boat. Or they started to doubt their own perceptions. So one of those two things. Okay? So that's social psych, groupthink, de-individuation, bystander effect, conformity, etc. Okay, chapter 12 is on personality. So in personality, you basically have to apply the theories that we talked about in chapter 1 to personality, right? There's another theory of personality that doesn't really relate. That's called a trait-based theory on personality. What do trait-based theories assume? Well, they assume both nature and nurture, but they view that personality is best understood by looking at kind of variables that are often divided using scales. So a classic example would be extroversion and introversion, right? So extrovert is somebody that, one simple way I've heard of explaining it, they get energized being around people. They like to be around people. It provides them with a sense of energy. If they're alone, they get drained. Introverts are the other way. They get energized, they recuperate all that alone, and then when they're with other people, they kind of get drained. That's a little simplistic, but that's one way to look at it. Okay, so trait-based theorists will break that down like that. The Freudian theory also has personality. Remember Freudian or the psychodynamic approach? The whole thing is based on what's going on in the unconscious. So they divide different parts of consciousness, the Freudians do, into three parts. What are those three parts? Id, ego, and superego, so understand the difference between those parts. Behaviorists would say that personality is what?
A result of all the things that lead up to that. It's like the disciplines that we're put through.
Yep, they're learned habits basically. So you are extroverted because in the past you were rewarded when you said hello to people and laughed and giggled and whatever. You were introverted because in the past you said hello to people and bad stuff happened or something. Then you were less likely to say hello to people. Okay. Humanistic theorists, remember, believe that, and this actually relates to motivation. It's something I forgot to talk about with motivation, now that I think of it. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Needs and drives. The whole idea there is that you have your base needs, your physiological needs, your safety needs that you have to fulfill before you can move up the ladder. What's the top called?
Self-actualization.
Self-actualization. So you gotta have all the base levels as you progress up. But anyways, back to personality. Humanistics believe that people are inherently good, that they always ultimately want to strive to fulfill their full potential, all that stuff. And they have free will. Behaviorists don't really think that when you're showing your personality, you're not really exhibiting free will, you're just responding to stimulus, right? So personality, again, that was fairly recent. I wouldn't worry about that one too much. All right. Chapter 13 is on disorders. So I'm not going to get real specific in disorders, like you don't have to know all the examples of different personality disorders. You wouldn't have to know, for example, specific examples of phobias. But if you're aware of the main classes of disorders, like we did that graphic where you had to identify the classes, that would help you. So anxiety, mood, dissociative, phobias, etc., personality disorders, all that. So with dissociative disorders, it's identity and memory are the issue. You have three main types: dissociative amnesia, fugue, and dissociative identity disorder. Understand the differences to that. With schizophrenia, you have positive and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms are where stuff gets added. Negative is where stuff gets taken away. In schizophrenia, what are the most common examples of positive symptoms that we talked about?
Hallucinations.
And
Delusions.
hallucinations and delusions. What's the difference?
Hallucinations are things that you can hear, see, or things like that, and
Delusions are like false beliefs.
Yep, that you hold even people disprove you. Like
Yeah.
you're like, I believe the first president of the United States was Abe Lincoln. What? No. Look at, here's a graph that shows us when, I still don't. He was really alive back then. Okay. Yeah. So, you know, but some people have, the delusions people have are different than that. Typically their delusions are like, I can read people's minds. You're like, no you can't. I knew that. I read your mind. Yeah. So, those are kind of delusions that people have, right? Okay. Last one, chapter 14 is on therapy. Again, this is applying the different perspectives to basically trying to treat people. So as it relates to therapy, you have like the humanistic approach to therapy. Oh yeah, that's fine. Yep. See you later. You have the humanistic approach where you have to show unconditional positive regard. You have the psychoanalytical approach, or psychodynamic, where you do free association, dream interpretation. You have the biological approach, which is more focused on drug treatments. Behavioral approach, things like systematic desensitization, flooding, we discussed that. So you might get a question like, which of the following things is most often used to treat phobias? And then I would say like, A, free association, B, drugs, C, this, and you have to pick the example of the therapy that would most match, right? Okay? All right, so that's it in a nutshell. If you have specific questions you don't understand, send me an email. I'll let you know. The days of the finals, I'll be here in my room working or in the social studies office. I'm not doing a formal review session during that time, but if you have a specific question, you don't understand, you want me to explain, come in and I'll help you. Okay? So thanks for coming. Make sure you sign in on the sheet. Have a good day.
yeah, you betcha.